Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free Microsoft 7680 certification training course. I'm James Messer, and in this module, we're going to look at all of the different installation sources you'll have available whenever you're working with Windows 7. This comes from the Windows 7 requirements where we are installing, upgrading, and migrating to Windows 7, specifically preparing the installation source, installing from USB, CD, network share, and WDS. Let's start with one of the most common installation sources that you'll find for installing Windows 7. This is the version that you'll have available if you were to buy Windows 7 right off the shelf, and that's a DVD-ROM, the read-only memory in DVD format. You can also at times download versions of Windows 7. This is the way that I got Windows 7 on my machine. I was running Windows Vista. I purchased Windows 7 online directly from Microsoft, and Microsoft just provided me with access to download it in an ISO format. It stands for the International Organization for Standardization. It's a standard format for CD-ROMs and DVD-ROMs, so that whenever you plug into anybody's DVD-ROM using anybody's media, you'll be able to read it whether you're on a Windows device, a Macintosh device, a Linux device. It really doesn't matter. It's all standardized for us. If you are installing Windows 7 on a few workstations, or you need to only install Windows 7 every once in a while, this may be a good option for you. The problem is it doesn't scale very well. One of the challenges you'll have if you're working in a large environment, you may need to install Windows 7 on 5 machines at a time, or 10 machines, or even 100 machines at a time, and going from one to the other with a DVD-ROM, or even trying to make 100 DVD-ROMs and put them in 100 different machines isn't the easiest way to go about doing things. So as we look at these different ways to work with Windows in these different environments, we'll start to see that there are some easy ways to do this and maybe some not so easy ways. If you're looking to scale, a DVD-ROM probably isn't the right version for you. If you've installed a lot of applications or worked a lot with DVD-ROMs, one of the things you know is that the ability to get information off of that optical media is not as fast as some other formats. If you are looking to speed things up a bit, you may want to consider having your image of Windows 7 on a USB drive, a memory stick, or some type of external USB connected storage. When you're using that, you can put all the files you need on there, and unlike a DVD-ROM, if you ever need to update drivers, add new drivers, or change anything with that image, you can simply write directly to this flash drive, add new files, or modify anything that's on there. So pretty flexible. If you're ever going to a machine from one to the other, you can just plug in your USB drive, and you've got the latest version of everything right there in front of you. As I mentioned, it's much faster than a DVD. We're really reading right from this USB, which is a relatively fast connection, and we're able to do it at speeds of this flash memory. We don't have to wait for a disk to spin around and have that laser beam read it or that LED read it. And when you don't have a DVD drive in a computer, and many machines don't these days, a USB connection may be exactly what you're looking for. Now, when you start buying the flash drive that you're going to use, you want to be sure there's enough space. And if you're using Windows 7 and you're installing the 32-bit version or the 64-bit version, neither of those is more than 4 gigs. So if you've got a 4 gig drive, then you'll be able to fit at least one of those editions right on there and be able to use it. Obviously, if you have the 8 gig or higher, you'll be able to put both versions on the same drive. So something to think about when you're buying that particular memory stick. You also have to keep in mind that this is exactly the same way of installing from a memory stick as it is for a DVD-ROM. So there's nothing changed with the process. You would plug in your DVD-ROM, or you would plug in this USB drive into a USB connection and boot the computer or start the installation from that drive. And if you have 100 computers to do, it doesn't change that scaling. You still have to go to all 100 computers with your USB stick to be able to install Windows 7. One thing to keep in mind if you're planning to use a USB key or a memory stick like this to launch Windows 7 when you're booting up, you need to initialize the memory stick so that it will be bootable by the operating system. And this is a little bit different than working with a floppy drive or a DVD-ROM or some other type of bootable media, because there is no format command that can simply format this USB key and have it available as a boot device. You'll need to use a program in either Windows Vista or Windows 7 7 called disk part, and you will need elevated permissions to do that. So you'll need to type in CMD and hold down the Control and Shift and hit enter, or simply right mouse click on the CMD when it comes up and choose to run it as an administrator. And what we're going to do is initialize this USB key, and then once it's initialized, you can copy all of the Windows files directly to it, and it will be both bootable and then have all of your Windows files all on that memory stick. Let's initialize a USB key that I have in my computer, and we'll get a feel for exactly how all of this works. Here's the command prompt on my computer. You can see that I am at an elevated prompt because right here on the title bar, it says administrator. If your title bar of your command prompt does not have the word administrator on it, then you are not at an elevated prompt. And when you try to type disk part in, it will tell you that you are not running in an elevated mode and you must be elevated with those extra permissions to be able to run the disk part program. When we first start disk part, it's going to quickly check all of the different drives that I have on my computer, and we can see what it's found by typing list disk. And it's going to show me I have a lot of different disks on my computer. I have disk 0 through disk 6, and you can see that I have different sizes on here as well. Now, I happen to know that the 4 gig flash drive that I've connected to this computer is disk number 6. If you're not quite certain, though, just take out the USB drive, do another list disk, and then put the drive back in, and you can see which one has changed. Hopefully you won't have quite as many disks connected to your computer as I do, but if you're trying to figure it out, know exactly, that's one way to do it. You want to be very careful about this because we are going to be erasing what's on that disk, and you don't want to get that wrong. You don't want to end up erasing one of the disks that's somewhere else on your computer. We're going to select disk 6, and it will tell me that disk 6 is now the selected disk. To confirm that, we can list disk again, and it will have an asterisk right next to the one that is selected. So that's what we would like to use. So make sure that one is your USB key, because the next steps we're going to do will be deleting everything that's on that particular key. If there is anything on that flash drive or that USB storage device that you would like to save, make sure you copy it off prior to this. So let's first type clean, and it will tell me pretty quickly, it will come back and say that disk part succeeded in cleaning the disk. And now we're going to create a partition on the disk, primary. And I'm going to create a primary partition just by typing in create partition primary, and it says that disk part succeeded in creating the specified partition. Now we're going to put a file system on there with the format command, and the file system that I'm going to put is FAT32. The FAT32 file system is one very common, and it's one that can be read by many different operating systems if you really needed it to. So that looks good to me. Let's also tell it that I'd like this to be a quick format. That's all we're really going to need for this particular USB drive. And now it's going to go through and very quickly come back and say that 100% of the drive was formatted and disk part successfully formatted the volume. At that point, all we have to do is make the partition active so that it is bootable, and in disk part says that it marked the current partition as active. And that's it. We're done. We can type exit to get out of disk part, and now we have a USB key that is bootable. Now all we have to do is take everything that's on our Windows 7 disk and copy it over to the USB key, and now we've got something bootable that we can use to boot and start the Windows 7 installation process. In many large environments, you may not want to walk around with a DVD-ROM or remember where you put the memory stick that you had available just for installing Windows 7. In larger environments, you already have file servers. Every device is already networked. You've got a lot of disk space available. You may choose to have all of your installation files out on a network share on a file server somewhere else in your environment. It makes it very easy to keep everything centralized, and you don't have to carry anything with you. But you still have this challenge of how do you boot up the computer to be able to access that share and start up the installation of Windows 7, especially if it's a computer that has no operating system on it at all. The way that you get around that problem is with something called the Windows pre-installation environment. This is essentially a bare bones version of Windows that is just enough to get booted, and at that point, it can then do other things. Windows PE becomes a very useful utility then because you can do a lot with this. Keep in mind, of course, that this is not unlike installing from a DVD-ROM or installing from a flash memory stick. You're just accessing all of the files across the network. The centralized installation media, though, is one where you can make changes to it, and now everybody who installs from that Windows 7 share has all of those new changes associated with it. So it is a little bit easier to maintain, even if it's not any more scalable than the others. If you're doing some diagnostics on a computer, many devices will use, or many people will use Windows PE on that device because it just makes it easier to run diagnostics programs and you're not having to boot the operating system, especially if you're working on a computer that's having some kind of problem that it can't boot the operating system. You can use Windows PE to do something like that. Nicest part about this, Windows PE, absolutely free. You can download it. Just Google for Windows Automated Installation Kit for Windows 7. That Windows AIK, the Automated Installation Kit, is something that is free from Microsoft, and it's made available to you so that you can do some of these automated installation tasks. We're going to use the AIK to be able to do a lot of things later on in this video series, like collect different images, use standard images and distribute them to multiple machines, and of course, it comes with Windows PE. Now, the Windows PE that comes with the Automated Installation Kit is not ready to go out of the box. You have to do a couple of things first to create an ISO image of something that you can use to boot from, but it's not really that difficult. Let's see how that would be done. You can install the Windows AIK on anything, on Windows Vista, on Windows 7. I've installed it on Windows Server 2008 because I'm going to use Windows Server as my central server that I'll use to administer Windows 7, to store images, to distribute images. I'll do everything from this centralized file server. So if you go and install the Windows AIK, you'll find in the All Programs, there is a Windows AIK option here. There's a folder that has in it a number of functions. I'm going to choose the one for Deployment Tools Command Prompt. This is a normal command prompt that also includes all the paths you'll need to run all of the little programs that come with the Windows Command AIK. And it's nice to have those there. That way you don't have to remember exactly where every single one of those little programs is located. I'm going to now use a program called Copy PE, and I'm just going to hit enter so you can see what it does. The Copy PE program will copy, and you can specify the platform you're using. We're going to use a 32-bit, the x86 platform, and copy all the files we'll need to create the Windows PE ISO into a folder called Windows PE-x86. That's exactly what I'd like to do. Let's just use their exact same command line, and I'm going to specify Windows PE-x86 and hit enter. And what the Windows AIK does, what this program does, is take all the files that you're going to need to finally build out your own Windows PE boot ISO and puts it all in that subdirectory. If we went to our Windows Explorer and look, there's the Windows PE-x86 that we just created right there off the root of the C drive. And if I drill down, you'll see there's a lot of things in here. There's an ISO directory, which has a lot of programs inside of that. There's a mount folder that doesn't have anything in it currently. There's the ETFS boot, which is the actual boot program for the Windows PE disk. And then there's this Windows image file, this WIM file. The Windows image file is one that we could even customize. We could add our own third-party applications to it. We could add diagnostics programs or other utilities that we would like to have available when we finally start things up and using this Windows PE. Now, in this case, in this particular video, we're not going to customize anything. I'm just going to use the stock Windows image, and we're going to add that into the folder that we will ultimately create the ISO file that then becomes this bootable device that will burn to a DVD-ROM or use as a boot device on our computer. What I want to do is now specify that Windows image file. I can do this either in the Windows Explorer, or I can type this in and just say, take that Windows PE backslash that winpe.wim file, just the default one with no changes whatsoever, and I want to copy that into the Windows PE-x86 ISO directory under the sources folder, and I want to rename it to boot.wim and hit enter. And now it's going to take that entire file and copy it over. And that's the one that's actually going to get booted whenever this creates this ISO file and builds everything out for me. That's what I'm now going to use whenever Windows PE starts up. So now that I've got everything copied and I built this structure that's in place, it's everything in this ISO directory is the structure that I'm going to use. And indeed, in that boot directory, I've got everything in here that I want to have booted up on this computer. When we created this and built out that ISO, it's in our sources boot, and there's the boot.wim that I created right inside of there. So we've got everything we need. What we now need is an ISO. After all, we need to be able to burn this to a DVD-ROM, and the ISO format is the standardized format that makes it very easy to do that. To build the ISO, we need another Windows program called OSCDIMG, and the command line parameters here, the -N specifies that I can use long file names. The -B specifies where these boot files are, and under Windows PE-X86, I have an etfsboot.com, and then I'm going to specify all of the files that will be included here, and those are in the Windows PE-X86 folder under the ISO directory, and I want to write the whole thing out to Windows PE-X86, and let's just make it the same name, Windows PE-X86.ISO, and hit enter. Now it's going to start compiling all of that information together, take all of the files that we've put into that ISO folder, make that bootable file of etfsboot.com as the main part of our ISO file, and it has now created an image file for us. And if we pop back over to our Explorer, you'll see that indeed about 138 meg image file is there called Windows PE-X86.ISO. Let's boot this up and see what happens. On my computer, I'm using VirtualBox to be able to run multiple operating systems at one time. So what I'm going to do is simulate myself putting in a DVD-ROM. Let's say I've already burned this out to a DVD-ROM. What I really did in my Oracle VirtualBox is just specify that when I'm booting here, just in my CD drive, use that ISO file. So I've skipped a step. Normally, I'd go to whatever I use to burn ISO files. There are a lot of third-party utilities, and now Windows Vista and Windows 7 will burn an ISO file just by default. But I'm just going to specify the ISO file right here in VirtualBox and save that extra step. And let's just boot the Windows 7 virtual machine that I have here, and it's automatically going to run that ISO file that's there. And what it does by default, I'm going to move my window back over here so you can see it. It goes through the Windows is loading files. This looks very similar to if I was booting Windows for the first time. It even has the same starting Windows option, and you're going to see the graphics come up for Windows. So it seems like I'm booting up Windows 7. And in reality, I am booting up Windows 7, but it's just a subset of the Windows 7 infrastructure. It is that pre-installation environment, the exact same things that you get when you run the install environment in Windows, and it runs the CMD.exe. There's a startnet.cmd that runs by default that initializes the Windows PE environment. And here I am. I'm now able to do things in a Windows prompt. It has me at an X prompt, but now I can access the hard drive. I can run diagnostics. I can do many, many different things. I can even install Windows now. I can map to a share drive. I can then from that share drive start the setup program and install Windows 7 on this computer that may have no operating system on the hard drive already. So just by having this boot device now, we can install from the network share and not have to carry around any DVD-ROMs or any additional flash drives or install media. I simply need that one PE boot disk, and now I have access to anything on the network. We've mentioned earlier these installation sources of DVD-ROM, the flash drives, and lastly, the share drive using Windows PE to boot with, but we've mentioned every time that that just doesn't scale very well. I can do one machine at a time, maybe 2 or 3 if I have enough media to do that, but if you need to do 100 machines, it becomes a little more complex. And obviously, in very large environments, you need to install Windows 7 on many, many machines all at once. One way that you can go about doing that is using something called Windows Deployment Services, and that's abbreviated WDS. And as the name implies, this allows you to automatically deploy operating systems out into your environment. You will need a network. You'll need Windows Server 2008, and you will need an Active Directory infrastructure already built. So this is really for a network that is large scale that already has an Active Directory infrastructure there. You will need either a network adapter that supports something called pre-boot execution environment. We call it PXE here in the business. That is an adapter card that is smart enough to know that if there's no operating system anywhere, go out to the network and see if you can find somewhere to boot from. And you can put these special servers on your network, and that PXE card will boot up automatically. You can also boot from what we call a Discover image that will have available that you can boot from so that your system will know where to connect to and where to start the deployment process and where to wait so that it can then become part of a larger group of devices that will all be installing Windows all at the same time. And it uses something to do this called multicast. What this means is that the central Windows Deployment Services device sends out the information once, and every machine that's listening can receive that set of information and do something with it. So I can install on one computer, 10 computers, 100 computers, or 1,000 computers simultaneously, and I'm still sending out the exact same information. I don't have to send the same information 100 times. I send it once, and that multicast means that anybody who's listening will be able to use that when I send it. So it's very, very efficient on the network to be able to do this. And as you can imagine, it scales extremely well. We can install the Windows deployment services and really have a nice, efficient, centralized way to install Windows 7 on many, many devices simultaneously. We'll do a lot with Windows deployment services later on this video series, but if you ever want to see it, you can go to your Windows server. Under Administrative Tools is the Windows Deployment Services option. And this is where we would add to our server or to multiple Windows deployment servers. We can add install images, boot images, legacy images. We can set up times to do these multicast transmissions. There's going to be a lot of things that we can do with this. And this is going to be a great way for you to be aware of the installation process for installing Windows 7 on many, many devices simultaneously, all through this very, very easy to use Windows deployment services. Let's see what we've learned about some of these installation sources. Let's say that you're planning to use a USB storage drive to install Windows 7, but how big does that storage drive need to be able to support the installation? Well, if you think back to the sizes we were talking about with those flash drives, you needed at least 4 gigabytes of free space so that you could install the entire operating system on there, either the 32-bit version or the 64-bit version. If you had a larger drive, like an 8 gig, you could even install both simultaneously. Which installation method would be the best for installing Windows 7 on 50 computers at exactly the same time? We were just looking at that. We were using Windows deployment services to be the best method for really scaling and doing multiple devices all at the same time. And the last question is, what would you use as a boot operating system if you were deploying Windows 7 via a network share? Well, in that particular case, you would need to build and have available a Windows pre-installation environment, which we always call Windows PE. That covers what you need to know for this module on installation sources. We have now understood preparing the installation sources for USB, CD, network share, and Windows deployment services. If you'd like to watch any of our absolutely free Microsoft configuration videos, you'd like to participate in our message boards, or much more, you can visit us on our website at professormesser.com.